Hi, I'm Amy, and today we are going to solve your multiple birthday mystery that you have in your family tree. Do you struggle with multiple birth dates listed for an ancestor? You don't know why that has happened. You don't know which one to pick. And sometimes you see a 10-year or occasionally even more difference in these years that they were born. Is it the same person? Could it possibly be somebody different? Today we're going to talk about why that happened and how you can determine what is most likely the correct birth date. So I'm going to give you 5 reasons why this happened. Reason number 1, they didn't have a Social Security card or a birth certificate. Social Security cards weren't beginning to be issued until the 1940s, and birth certificates in many states were not issued by the state until like 1917. Some states it was earlier, and some states they didn't really have adherence until after that. So if you're looking for an ancestor that was born in the 1800s, you're probably not going to find a birth certificate for them. And so if they didn't have a birth certificate and they didn't have a state issued ID like we do today for a driver's license, then they didn't have any record that kept track of their age. And when they would go somewhere and tell somebody in a court of law or somewhere else how old they were, they just had to take their word for it. The second reason is they forgot. I mean, when you're little, when you're 5 or 10, you know your birth date to the year and probably the month. And how many months will you be 11? But when you're my age, I have to think about how old I am when somebody asks how old I am. And as people got older, they just didn't remember because they didn't have anything that was keeping track of it for them. It was something that they didn't necessarily hold on to. And sometimes they had a good reason to be less than honest. If you were getting married and you had to have a affidavit from your father to marry before the age of 16, let's say, and that varied in different places at different time periods, then you might tell them that you were 16 when you were really 15. Or maybe you wanted to go out and fight. You might say that you were 18 when you really weren't 18 yet. Or maybe the flip is true. Maybe you wanted to say you were older than you really were in order to maybe avoid the draft or avoid going into the military. Reason number 4 involves who provided the information. Sometimes the information was provided by somebody who didn't really know, or maybe they were in a time of stress and couldn't remember. This happened a lot with death certificates. Oftentimes, birth information on death certificates is not correct because the informant on the death certificate may not really remember. Maybe it's their elderly father or grandfather, and they're not exactly sure what year they were born. Again, they didn't have state IDs. They didn't have this information that we can rely on now to keep track of that information. They didn't have that then. And this was a time of stress. They just lost somebody dear to them. And so maybe they just weren't thinking clearly. The other thing that happened on death certificates is maybe the person had really not a major relationship to the individual who'd passed away anyway. So you want to look at who the informant was on the death certificate and pay attention to whether or not they would even know and give them some grace in case they may have gotten it wrong. In our family, we have a headstone that is incorrect in my father's side of the family. So it wasn't just the death certificate that may have been wrong. They may have put the wrong information on the granite headstone. And then finally, sometimes we're going off the indexed information off of the record, or maybe the record is not the original record and somebody working in the county or state has transcribed the information. I had a situation with the client where a man's age looked like 25. But in reality, it was 75. And the only way I was able to distinguish between the 7 and the 2 was to compare his writing in other places on the form. That was a huge difference. So this guy was missed as being his census record because everybody thought, well, that can't be him because it's 50 years different. So look at the image. So how do you know? What's the best way to figure out what is the correct birth month and date and year? There's a couple of different things to pay attention to. 1, the closer to their birth, the more likely the record is correct. So if you can have a birth certificate, great, right? That's going to be correct. If you have a baptismal record, that is probably going to be correct. The baptism may have happened a few years after their birth, but a lot of baptismal records also include the birth date as well as the baptismal date. If this video is helpful for you, please give it a like and comment. Let me know what you've learned, or let me know if you have additional suggestions. Now let's get back to the video. And now I'm going to talk about censuses, and oftentimes the information in the census is incorrect. It could have been a neighbor that provided the information, or it could have been one of the kids in the family and they don't remember, but the census can be really helpful. It puts their ages. And so what you want to do is you want to gather every census record for an individual, and you want to compare them to the other members of their family. Let me give you an example. Here we have Joseph Spielman in 1880. He lived in Salem, Carroll County, Illinois. He's 52 years old at the time of his record, and his wife, Anna, is 40. They have a daughter, Emma, who's 17, Frank, who's 13, and a son, Harry, who's 11. In addition to Ella, 9, Clara, 7, and Charlie, 3. So Ella would have been born in about 1871, and Clara would have been born in about 1873. But maybe I find a record later that says Clara was actually born in 1871. Well, when I see her in this record, it's showing that it would be pretty difficult for her to be born in 1871 because she had a sister born at that time period. So that can kind of help me put things in perspective. And then when I look at this family in an earlier census record in 1870, I see that Frank is 4, Harry is 2, and Ellie is 1. So that goes along with that 1880 census record, and that gives me some time period of when they were born. Frank, it says that he was 13 in 1880, so he would have been born in about 1867. And here it says he's 4, so he would have been born in about 1866. Now let me show you another record really quickly. Here we have the James Assay family. And if you look at the bottom, we see Edith was 8 months old at the time, 8/12. So that means I look at the top of the census record. So at the top of the census record, I see that this census was taken on the 7th of June in 1880. So that would place Edith's birth in about October of 1879. So now I have a birth month on top of the birth year. Now, if you want to turn to the 1900 census, that's even better because the 1900 census gave the birth month as well as the birth year. So this provided me a lot more information. So I'm going to take this information and I'm going to put it in perspective. Let's say I have a death certificate that says that Joseph was born in March of 1823, but I have the census record that says that he was born in November of 1823. That would be a little bit of a dilemma because the census record, he may have been the one that had provided the information on the family. Again, it could have been a neighbor, so it may be incorrect. But if I can find maybe a draft card for him or some other record that provides his date in November, that November month is going to trump the death certificate because I'm going to assume that that November date is correct. Sometimes what I've done for clients or for my own research is I will find a later record that says that somebody was born on the 7th of July in a particular year. But then I find them in the census that they were actually born a year later. And so I'm going to assume that maybe the date and the month is correct, but the year had been confused. So then I'll just change the year. Let me give you an example of that really quick. So we talked about the Assay family. So here we have the Assay family in the 1900 census, living in the same area. And we see James and we see his wife Charlotte, but we see a son George who was born in July of 1879. Now in 1880, it's clearly the name Edith, a girl's name, and she's a female. And so we know that she was born in about October of 1879. But now all of a sudden we have a son George born in July of 1879. Now I would do further research on this family, but my guess in this situation is that they mixed up the birth years. This census was taken in June of 1880, all right? And so this record in 1900 is saying that George was born in July of 1879. My guess is George was actually born in July of 1880, right after that census had been taken. I would need to do further research on this, but if I couldn't find anything else that contradicted it, and I did find that Edith had passed away and they weren't somehow being confused, which it would be really surprise me if those two individuals had been confused, I would believe that George was actually born in July of 1880 instead of 1879. So the best way to do this is to evaluate the record. Look at when it was created, how close to the birth it was created. Who provided the information? Are they a reliable person to have provided accurate information? Was there a reason for the information to be altered, like for marriage or military, like we discussed previously? Was the record indexed? Maybe you should go find that original record and see if there's a difference in it. That's good research strategy anyway. You always want to be dealing with original records whenever possible. And keep in mind that as we get older, we're more forgetful. So again, you want to be looking at those earlier records the most. And remember to look at the image. Well, if you put these strategies into place, I think you're going to have a better time of figuring out the actual birth date of those mysterious relatives with multiple birth years or birth dates. I hope this has been helpful for you. Please like it if it has. I would so appreciate that. Please subscribe to the channel and click that bell so that you get notifications when I release a new video. And I hope you have a great day. Thanks.